War has always carried the same unbearable weight, no matter the era or the nations involved. When it erupts, it does not distinguish between borders, languages, or flags. It shatters families, reshapes landscapes, and alters the destinies of generations. In the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, this ancient pattern has unfolded once more. Streets that once held ordinary life, shops, schools, laughter, now echo with absence. Homes built over decades have collapsed into ruins in moments. Families who once planned for the future now cling to survival, and the world watches as history repeats its most painful lessons. At the center of this unfolding tragedy lies a plea not from governments, strategists, or armies, but from humanity itself, urging both sides to recognize that no victory can compensate for the price being paid in human lives. To understand how events arrived at this point, it is necessary to look back at the long, intertwined history of Russia and Ukraine. Their relationship spans centuries, beginning with shared Slavic roots and early cultural connections. Over time, empires rose and fell, borders shifted, and political influences changed. Ukraine spent long stretches under Imperial Russian control, later becoming an integral part of the Soviet Union before emerging as an independent state in 1991. This independence brought new aspirations, new alliances, and new questions about identity, security, and sovereignty. Russia, shaped by its own historical experiences and geopolitical concerns, viewed many of these changes through the lens of strategic vulnerability. These conflicting perspectives built layers of tension that simmered beneath the surface for years, and though diplomacy offered several moments of hope, none were strong enough to undo the weight of past grievances. As years passed, political disagreements deepened, and national narratives hardened. The world witnessed territorial disputes, contested borders, and failed ceasefires that only widened the divide. Each attempt at negotiation came burdened with mistrust and incompatible goals. Ukraine sought protection, independence, and integration with institutions it believed would secure its future. Russia emphasized historical ties, security zones, and fears of encirclement. Miscalculations, rising nationalism, and external pressures accelerated the breakdown of communication. What began as political friction evolved into a confrontation where dialogue grew faint and military action grew loud. History shows that wars rarely ignite from a single spark, they emerge from accumulated misunderstandings, unaddressed fears, and lost chances to compromise. This conflict followed the same painful trajectory. Once fighting began, it was civilians who bore the harshest consequences. Families were uprooted with little more than what they could carry. Entire communities crossed borders seeking safety, leaving behind everything familiar. Those who remained endured constant danger, with infrastructure collapsing around them. Hospitals struggled with overwhelming casualties, power stations were damaged, and education systems were disrupted. Parents tried to reassure children while coping with their own shock and grief. In both Russia and Ukraine, mothers mourned sons they would never see return, and families received news that ended their world in an instant. History has shown repeatedly that while armies march and leaders strategize, it is the ordinary people who endure the deepest scars. This war has been no exception. Beyond the immediate battlegrounds, the world has felt the tremors of this conflict. Global markets have been shaken, energy supplies disrupted, and diplomatic alliances tested. Nations far from Eastern Europe reassessed their security postures, fearing the possibility of broader instability. Conflicts between major regional powers often trigger a chain reaction, influencing political decisions continents away. The humanitarian crisis has grown large enough to impact neighboring countries, global organizations, and economies reliant on trade routes the war has disturbed. These ripple effects echo historical patterns seen in many major conflicts. What begins as a regional confrontation soon reshapes international dynamics. Previous wars have demonstrated how prolonged fighting drains national resources, fractures societies, and sets back development for decades. As these long-term consequences unfold, history offers its most sobering lesson. No matter how justified either side believes its actions to be, the toll of prolonged conflict grows heavier with every passing day. Nations can rebuild infrastructure, economies can eventually recover, and borders can be redrawn, but the lives lost cannot be restored, and the trauma carried by survivors cannot be erased. The conflict between Russia and Ukraine has already carved deep wounds into both societies, wounds that will influence how future generations understand identity, neighborliness, and trust. The tragedy now unfolding stands as a crossroads. The suffering experienced by countless families, the destruction of once thriving cities, and the escalating humanitarian burden form a stark warning deeply rooted in history. Humanity's plea is simple yet urgent: recognize the cost, acknowledge the shared pain, and understand that the continuation of war serves no future worth building. The path forward requires compassion, restraint, and a willingness to see the human being on the other side of the conflict. Only through such recognition can the cycle of loss be broken, and only through compromise can new hope begin to rise from the ashes left behind. Throughout history, nations have discovered that the path out of devastation rarely begins with triumph on the battlefield but with leaders willing to halt the momentum of destruction. Compromise has often emerged not from weakness but from the recognition that futures cannot be rebuilt on shattered lives. In eras marked by fierce rivalries, states eventually stepped back from the brink when the cost of continuing outweighed any imagined benefit. Agreements such as the easing of Cold War hostilities or peace frameworks that ended long-standing regional conflicts serve as reminders that even the most entrenched disputes can be resolved when both sides admit that survival and dignity matter more than total victory. These moments did not erase the pain that came before, but they allowed nations to reclaim stability and turn their attention toward reconstruction instead of endless retaliation. History also warns what happens when such compromise is rejected. Periods marked by unchecked escalation show the dangerous consequences of allowing pride, fear, or political pressure to overpower the instinct to protect one's people. Examples of conflicts that dragged on far beyond their logical endpoint demonstrate how societies can unravel under the weight of exhaustion. Economies collapsed not because they lacked potential, but because their resources were consumed by unending war. Civil institutions weakened as governments prioritized warfare over welfare. Families faced generational trauma as children came of age knowing only loss, displacement, and uncertainty. This pattern emerges repeatedly across centuries. Wars that stretched too long reshaped nations in ways their leaders never intended. The Russia-Ukraine conflict now stands in a similar phase, where further escalation risks embedding sorrow so deeply that it becomes part of the collective identity of both nations. The longer the fighting continues, the more difficult it becomes to envision a future not defined by bitterness. Amid these warnings, the human element remains the most powerful reminder of what is at stake. Families on both sides endure a level of grief that cannot be measured by strategic gains or territorial changes. Ukrainian towns once vibrant with everyday life now carry the weight of destroyed homes and missing loved ones. Russian families, too, have received news that their sons will not return, leaving empty chairs at dinner tables and futures abruptly cut short. These losses transcend nationality, ideology, or state narratives. They reveal a shared vulnerability that defines all human beings, an emotional reality often overshadowed by political objectives. War reduces the complex richness of life into statistics, yet behind every number is a story that will never fully heal. Generational trauma does not dissipate with ceasefires. It lingers in the way communities rebuild, in how children interpret danger, and in how adults navigate grief. This shared suffering becomes the foundation of a plea not shaped by political preference, but by compassion for ordinary people caught in extraordinary tragedy. The future remains uncertain, but historical precedent shows how quickly the window for recovery narrows the longer a conflict persists. Infrastructure decay, educational disruption, and economic decline accumulate quietly until they become enormous obstacles to progress. Children who lose access to stable schooling face long-term disadvantages that shape the trajectory of their entire lives. Medical systems strained by war struggle to return to normal even years after fighting ends. Trust between communities erodes as divisions solidify, making reconciliation a monumental challenge. When viewed through this historical lens, the ongoing conflict threatens not just the present but the next several decades of social and economic development for both Russia and Ukraine. No matter the political outcome, the scars of prolonged fighting would persist in every institution, every community, and every family. Amid this landscape, the call for peace becomes not a naive ideal but a necessary demand for the preservation of nations. It is a recognition that humanity cannot endure cycles of destruction without losing something essential. The plea to both sides is rooted in the understanding that ending the war does not require abandoning national pride or historical memory. It requires the courage to prioritize life over vengeance. Compassion and negotiation are not signs of surrender. They are the foundations upon which every lasting peace in history has been built. Thus, the message stands. Humanity asks Russia and Ukraine to consider the immense cost already paid and the even greater cost waiting should the conflict continue. The wounds inflicted on both societies are deep, but they need not define the generations to come. A future shaped by rebuilding, not further devastation, is still possible. Choosing compromise today is the only way to prevent tomorrow from being marked by even more loss. Only through restraint, empathy, and a willingness to stop the cycle can hope take root again in places where sorrow has become far too common.